So my wife can do this presentation better than I can now, because for the last about 4 or 5 years I talk a lot about this family who I am related to, and we'll kind of get into that, and at the end I'm going to give a little division update, and if y'all got any questions about stuff happening in the Tennessee division, we can talk about some of that as well. So Solomon Shaw is who we'll talk about tonight. He's a Gibson County native. Now where he's buried, his property is in Crockett County. And Crockett County was formed in the 1870s, but he was devoted to the South. And you're going to find out about his devotion and that he gave his life for it. So let's give a little background on who the Shaw family is, how I'm connected to them, and kind of how they got to West Tennessee. Timothy Shaw is the oldest part of this family. As you can see, he's my 6th great-grandfather. Born in Ireland, pretty tall for his time, 5'10", and you can see a little bit about him in the Virginia militia there. And then they moved to Wake County, North Carolina, where all my folks are going to come from, the Shaw family and the Bledsoe family, we'll talk a little bit about tonight. Make their way from Wake County through Middle Tennessee and finally to Gibson County in the 1820s. So something we're going to learn interesting about the man highlighted down here, Zechariah, which is his son, who is a Revolutionary War patriot. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a little extent, but it's interesting how we learn these names, and if you do genealogy, you can spend hours and hours and hours, always to learn something new. Just when you think you've got it solved and figured out, some new document, new information will come about. So you can kind of see a little bit about him, where he was at in Wake County, some of these early land grants and some of the deeds that are out there. He's got at least 3 children we know of, John Baptist Shaw, and I've always been one skeptical in genealogy when you see weird names like that. Is that a legit name? Well, it's on all his wheels and stuff. He is listed as John Baptist Shaw, but he was Methodist. So that was quite interesting. Zechariah, who is my 5th great-grandfather, Revolutionary War patriot, and then Zacchaeus, who was killed during the Revolution as a substitute for Zechariah. He went back in, came home, and died. There's possibly another son by the name of Gabriel that shows up, but very little is known about him. He's mentioned in a will, but he could also be another relative or a cousin. So Zechariah, let's talk about him. He's the father of Solomon, we're going to get into. Born December the 17th, 1754. We get his exact birth date from his papers when he files for his pension. He tells a little bit about him as he's interviewed. And this is where we learn about his father that we just saw there. But what's interesting, he mentions his father 3 times in this document. He never calls him by name, which for the genealogist, that's like, man, you tell everything you need to know about him, but you don't give me his name. But through research, we can prove who he is. Well, by the age of 3, he's made it to Wake County, North Carolina. We don't have a marriage record for Zechariah, but if you follow the Christian naming pattern, you can pretty much tell who his wife was, who was a Priscilla Jones. And we'll talk a little bit about the Jones family in Gibson County, how they all tie in together and are all related. Again, we didn't travel very far back then, so cousins married cousins, so you have a lot of that. So that may be what's wrong with some of us. Children, he had at least 8 children we know of. They're named in his will, all of them, and one of them's even deceased, so it's really nice to have a complete list of all his children. A couple of them disappear in the 1830s. Don't know what happened to them, whether they died or left, and they pretty much disappear. He's a patriot. He enlisted there in the war, and he served about 2.5 years before you don't see any more records on him, and by his pension application he tells about. He received that pension in Gibson County in 1834, and then by mid-1836 he's died in Gibson County. He comes there in September of 1829, and since I should have updated this page here, we know exactly pretty much when he came down, what month he made his way to Gibson County. In that August of 1829, he sells property in Wake County in late July, so probably sometime between late July and that date in September that we have, that he made his way to Gibson County. What a journey that had to be from Wake County to Gibson County, Tennessee. And again, he's dead in mid-1836, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Gibson County. He's one of probably 7 or 8 patriots we know for sure that made their way to the county, probably others that just never made it to a census record. But he is there, and he's pretty well thought of. You see him on several documents in the early days of Gibson County. It's pretty neat to have his actual signature, and it's not one that's from a book bound. It's his actual paper, and you can see the different writings. It's nice to know that he could write as well. So his son is most likely his youngest son. We don't have the birth dates of all the kids. A couple of them we know, again, they don't have tombstones. We don't know for sure where they're buried. So you don't have all their listing in order. But we know that Solomon was born Independence Day 1804 in Wake County, North Carolina. Now, if you'll do any research in Gibson County, this name will come up a lot. There's also another Solomon that will come up. It gets real interesting when you start to look up the name Solomon Shaw in Gibson County in the 1820s, 30s, and even into the early 40s, because there's at least two of them by the same name. They're both related, they're cousins. They get into some estate dealings when would have been his cousin as well that passed away. The other Solomon's father, this one gets the charge of that estate. There's a big lawsuit, goes to the Tennessee State Supreme Court on it. And what did it involve? A lot of land, a lot of money. So you'll find out that Solomon is pretty wealthy. We see in the height of his time, he owned at least 30 slaves, and somewhere over 5,000 acres have been able to document through different deeds that have changed hands and he sold. So a lot of land in the Quincy community, which is between Alamo and Trenton, off Highway 54 is where he's buried, which would have been the center part of that plantation. So he's there in Gibson County, of course, by 1830. Some of his children, the two we'll talk about today, there's a few others. He was twice married. Solomon Edward Shaw, which was the Edwards come after Martha, and then a Seneth or Senny. We'll get into Senny's story because this really kind of revolves around her from a 1905 article that appeared in a Nashville newspaper. The same time the Sam Davis Monument's going up in Nashville, they're telling about this young hero. Well, they want to tell about this heroine and what she was doing, how the women of the time were really important as well. So you get that story from a local man that was in Trenton that later moved to Nashville. Again, in the full story, which is a full newspaper length, 4 or 5 columns of the story, there's a lot of romantic stuff added to it, fancy words. He pretties it up, but you can really get the gist of who Senny was and how she played a role in Solomon's murder on September the 22nd, 1862. He is involved in a little bit of everything. We know he was also a Baptist minister, possibly. He appears in some newspapers, writing some articles back to a Nashville paper. He was involved in that Masonic Lodge, as you can see, the emblem there on the marker, which is now the Alamo Lodge, which was originally the Quincy Lodge. He was a founder of, and involved in politics too. He tried to make a run for Confederate Congress very first, and he didn't get very far, and I don't think he ever made it to the actual ballot, but newspapers tell you that he wanted to run. So he was highly respected and highly thought of. So let's talk about this character. His son, he's my first cousin 5 times removed. That says we're pretty close to each other, pretty close related. So he's born October the 8th, 1841. Again, he farms, just a young man when he dies, and he enlists in the 7th Tennessee out of Haywood County in Duckworth. And then he's shot that same day in the home, as we'll tell about the story. You'll learn more about the whole situation. Dies at Franklin, not as the Battle of Franklin, as we're familiar with, at 64. But a little early, he dies there and is brought home by Senny. And we'll learn more about that as we go along. There's his tombstone there in Quincy and Crockett County. So we don't have a photograph of Solomon Edward, or Senny, but we do have one of her husband, Captain Wise Cooper, that came from, I believe, Murfreesboro, and made his way to Gibson County. And we have to tell a little bit about their marriage, because in the newspaper article it says she's a young girl when all this happens, about 16 or 17. They were waiting till after the war for some young man to get her hand in marriage. Well, you learn she's just acquired a big estate after her father's been killed. So another gentleman in Gibson County, we kind of laughed about, you wonder, was it he just loved her so much he came from Murfreesboro, no other connection, or was it the money? Or was it that large estate that was waiting? I think the money helped it. I'd love to find a photograph of her. They were wealthy. They probably had a likeness made in the 1850s, I'm sure, in Gibson County, and hopefully that might show up one day. But they have 4 children, or 4 boys and 3 girls, and then later they will own the mill. You'll see that this mill is important in the story. He serves in the House of Representatives, moved to Fort Smith, and they're buried there shortly not too long after moving in. Then you can see their stone. And there's a picture of him from his graduation and the law school that he was in. So Calvin Shaw, he's one of the players in the story here. Been recently, as this story is ever changing, new information coming along, you learn more about him, he's told about the story. But after starting to do a little research on him, you find a little more about him. He's the one that's going to really instigate, which is going to cause the murder of Solomon Shaw. He's one of the slaves. The story will go on to tell about young Solomon here as he goes off to war, that you really shouldn't trust Calvin. He's about the same age of him. They've raised around each other, but you shouldn't trust him. He's going to betray you. It's what Charlie Buck Harwood, who tells the story, says he don't trust him, and we'll find out they should have listened to that because that was the truth. So he's involved, left the plantation, and what's interesting, when this occurred September of 1862, I can imagine what these Yankee soldiers and these federal troops that were in Trenton promised the slaves there on the plantation and young Calvin, what he was promised, but not too much longer later you find him in the United States Colored Troop. So probably not what he was promised that he thought he was going to do. But what's interesting about him, it says a lot about his character and who he was, because he's dishonorably discharged in 1865 for robbery. So we know he already helped lead to a murder, and he wasn't worth too much. He shows up in 1880 in Madison County and kind of disappears after that. But Calvin is there during this time as well, and again went off with young Solomon for a period of time. So let's look at the Shaw property. Again, this is in the Quincy community in the mid part of Crockett County. It was Gibson County at the time. The yellow dot on the left is where Solomon and them were buried in that small cemetery there. And this is, again, you see the cemetery down that way. The river, the Forked Deer River, there's Highway 54. The old road, of course, you would see would have gone that way, the mill in that vicinity. And I still think you can see some, there was a later mill that was burned. One burned during the war, later one afterwards. You can still see some of the foundations of it. But that's just some of his land. That's not 5,000 acres, obviously, but it gives you an idea of what the size of what he had. So let's talk about what it was like in Gibson County at that time in 1862 under federal occupation. Some stories that are told in the Trenton newspaper by this same Mr. Harwood tells he was 10 to 14 era is his age in that time, but he gives where people lived and who was doing what, who were some of the troops who were in there, how they treated them. They talk about most of them were pretty good guys. They didn't really bother anybody until the 2nd Kansas comes in, and he calls them a few choice words of what they thought to them and what they did to the folks in Trenton and Gibson County, and how far they were going out to just go through everything, steal, and cause a lot of havoc. And these stories, it tells there were many that were hung and killed in Trenton. Time has caused their names to be lost. We'd love to know who they were and the horrible deaths they did. Another one that was in Trenton at the time, he's related to this Solomon Shaw, was chased outside of town for his horse. They killed him, stabbed him, it says, and took all his clothes off of him, left him there. The slaves came and took him back into town, just for his clothes. So just an idea of what these Yankees did to the folks locally. But the 2nd Kansas are the ones who are going to be responsible for this murder. Your official records and some of the muster rolls will not show some of these things in here. We'll find out one of these men on the plantation that day in September were killed, but any of the muster rolls or any kind of records don't show that occurring, which I want to believe the local man's story that probably did happen. So we know the 2nd Kansas is there. There's the Gibson County Courthouse. It was interesting that this is pictured because Solomon Shaw was one of the builders of that building in 1841. When that building was built for like $19,000 in the 1840s, which was a lot of money then. It first got to what we know as the county commission today, the county court, and they didn't approve it. Well, they came back and made some more changes. They approved it to pass, and then they don't finish it. They said it wasn't finished to the specs. It lacked $120-something to finish it to what they needed. Well, after 2 or 3 months, the court argues, finally spend the money, and they finish the building. And there's the building that stood till 1899. The current courthouse we have today replaced it. There's some Harper's Weekly, the depot area, kind of what it looks like when Forest Raid occurred in December of '62. So here's a little bit more about Solomon Shaw, the younger one. Of course, enlisted in the Haywood Rangers in Brownsville. A lot of probably familiar with Colonel Duckworth. He's very well known in the area. Reading something about him the other day that Mr. Lynn Shaw wrote about what a scoundrel he was during the first days of the war, but he became a Methodist minister afterwards. Turned out to be a pretty good guy. One of my other ancestors also served under him. And then, of course, we learned about Calvin Shaw. So now let's get into the incident and the murder. It won't take a long time, but kind of give you the gist of what occurred on that September day. I get this vision in my mind of what this plantation looked like. We don't have, like you see, the Natchez, Mississippi homes, and even in Jackson, we didn't have those kind of homes in Gibson County. There's just no record of those large homes. So it's a small wooden frame structure, I'm sure, but it was nicer than most would have had. So they've shown up to this house, as the story says. But I get like a more modern view in my mind. Them at this house. It says they're in the backyard. Now I think of my backyard. Well, they could have heard what was going on. But again, this is a different time, a bigger area. So 2 federal soldiers have shown up at the house to arrest Shaw, is what the story says. Well, the older Solomon comes around the house, beats them. What are you here for? He said, we're my orders by General Grant to blah, 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 do this and that. Well, of course, Shaw says, well, he's nowhere around. Well, this doesn't make any sense. Why would you be doing this? Well, that's quickly learned what the intention was. It was to rob them and, of course, end up killing some of the family members. Solomon Shaw there in the scuffle that occurred on that porch in September of '62. They go into the front hall, back and forth. Solomon is shot in the chest. It tells that he falls dead on the porch. Younger Solomon shot in the head. The story says it grazed his head and went up into the ceiling. And at this point, he disappears. He gets 2.5 miles away from the home during this time. And they find him a couple of days later, barely alive. So that fight is ensued inside the main hall. We learned younger Solomon was trying to get into the house to get his pistols that were in a back room, but that door had been locked from the other way. So tells the slaves had most likely come through and locked that. And we know Calvin is there at the time. So he's the one that's probably been to Trenton to do work for the plantation, to pick up supplies or whatever he's been sent to pick up with others. Well, these federal troops have promised him who knows what and convinced him to come back out there, and they showed them this property. Of course, Solomon, one of the most wealthiest men in Gibson County at the time, so this was going to be a good find for these Yankee soldiers that day. Well, Solomon's dead. We learn about the daughter Cynthia's on the property as well at that time. And she's out and about watching all this from a distance. Well, brother's been shot in the house. Dad's dead. Well, she's going to defend the property. So the story, it's kind of humorous to watch the way it describes it, is that she's running around the property chasing one of these federal soldiers, firing at him. And talks about her 2 pistols that are on her hip. So you get this image of this antebellum girl with these 2 pistols on her hip chasing these soldiers around in the yard. So it makes me think when her husband came to take her hand in marriage, she might not just been a beautiful lady. She may have been a little rough around the edges. Just got a tough image. But she was going to defend her home. Solomon is truly devoted to the South because he gave his life for it. Slaves, it says, had the wagon ready to go. One of the federal soldiers had been shot. One, the story says, was killed. A lieutenant. But we don't find the lieutenant killed in any official record. But I want to believe this local man that they knew what occurred that day. The other ones that are on site or close by, the son-in-law, he comes up after the murders happened. Their plantation or farm was close by, within a couple of miles. So they've heard the commotion there, helped bring the body back inside, and they're, of course, all buried there. If you're familiar with the Buck Creek Trail Ride that takes place in Crockett County, Terry Weaver has on his farm, that's the same family. So a little bit about the meal now that's out there. So Solomon's been killed. We know that this meal is burned. 2 or 3 stories tell us this. Whether it was burned that same time or not, most likely probably happened that day as they're making their way back out across. They burn his meal. It's later going to be built by Wise Cooper. Still prosperous even through the 1880s when they finally sell it. It was operated all the way up through the 1930s. It was still an active meal at that location. So here's a little bit more about Solomon Edward and his death. So Cynthia has lost her father. The mother's still living. The brother has been nursed back to health. It says she's nursed him back to health. And it tells a really pretty story of how she's taken care of her wounded brother, gotten him back in, and he leaves, and she helps him get down through the bottoms of the 4th of Year River to escape federal soldiers that are stationed at some of these bridges. A very romantic story it tells, and then it gets to when they're going to part each other, and that she gives one final kiss to her brother that she'll never see again alive. So he's died of fever, of course, in May of 1863 in Franklin. Now the story says she went alone all the way to Franklin from that farm to bring her brother back. It's pretty tough. That's a long way to go by yourself. Your slaves are gone at this point. We know that. They've all left the farm. So she's by herself. And she goes and gets her brother. So in the estate papers of her brother, I found this recently going through some of the things at the archives and looking up their estates. And it has a list of the items that were sold from the estate. He didn't have much. He was young. But listed, one of the things Cindy gets are 2 pistols. I just thought that of the things she could have bought in that estate, there's some silverware and other things, but she bought the 2 pistols. She's still only about 17, 18 years old at this point. But you think those are probably the pistols he had on him and he carried with him. It's her epitaph, or his epitaph that's on his stone, I think says so much to the story and then to what's actually in writing. He was a devoted son and a loving, ever-true brother who was defending his home that day in September. This was another recent document found going through Solomon Sr.'s estate papers. If you've done any archival research in that time, and you'll see in the estate the loose papers that are still, most of them are little small folders, 10, 20 documents on most of them. But of course, Solomon owned so much, his stack is literally that deep. Things that were for sale, stuff he owned, partnerships he had. Well, a little small scrap of paper that you can see here that was stuck in there. Talks about the estate here, and then it tells, I mentioned up here, that they wanted the slaves prosecuted on a charge of murder of Sid Shaw. It really tells you a lot about the story that when you go, that, well, of course, in 1862 and through 1864, obviously the time when that document is, there was not going to be any trial. There wasn't going to be anybody charged with that murder. It was a big deal at the time. In 1862, all the newspapers across the state and the South, and even some northern newspapers, picked this story up. It shows how well-to-do Solomon Shaw was and how it really fueled the Southern cause at the time and would get that anger built up. Look what they've done, because this is still pretty early in the war when this has occurred, and there's several different articles from around the South and tell about that same story. They came in disguise. They're all similar and varying story. But it was a big deal that Solomon Shaw was killed in '62. So here's the man, Charlie Buck Harwood, who was from Trenton, who had moved to Nashville, done pretty well for himself. And he was all the time writing in the Nashville American, little history bits. Most of them at the time were from the Nashville area, but he was from Trenton, raised there. And he tells a few, and this is one of them. The week before, it talks about that he's going to have an article coming up to tell something that's probably never been told that should be. And this young heroine of West Tennessee, where he tells, you can see this whole story in detail about what occurred in that September day. So if you're in our area, and some may even this far down, this story travels that there's buried treasure. I know Jim's probably heard about this. People for generations have been saying there is buried treasure somewhere on Solomon Shaw's farm. Nobody's found it yet. But there has to be some truth to this, and it's in the couple of stories that tells a little bit more about it and kind of how the story has come about. So when young Solomon was off to war, Judge McDowell, who was from Gibson County, later lived in Memphis, he tells this story in a Memphis newspaper that he was serving with Shaw. He told him, he said, hey, this is after his father probably was already killed. He said, somebody needs to know where this money is. Mother does not know where we buried this gold on the farm, and I need to tell somebody. Well, he couldn't ride home because, I mean, that falls in the wrong hands. He's just giving away where the gold is. Of course, then he dies in May of '63, and Judge McDowell says that story was never got back to where they buried the gold. So somewhere on that large estate rests some coins or some kind of money. And it was probably a good bit. You only had one branch, the Bank of Tennessee in Trenton at the time. They weren't putting that money there. He was keeping it on his own. So Judge McDowell tells that story that it was never located. Now, people for generations still been searching. Michael Avery, some may know Michael. He's searched his farm adjoins some of this, and said they've been looking since the 50s there and never found it. And I told him, I said, since you're closest to it, it could be on your farm now, on the Avery farm. I said, so if you find that, we have to split that. Well, what? Why would we split this? I said, I think there's some guy, I said, we can get some attorneys involved. I think since I'm descended from him and related to him, don't I have some kind of right to this money? He said, how are you going to prove it was Solomon's? Yeah. Hopefully we find it and we'll be living in a big, nice mansion here on the river when that happens. So I think Edward Ward Carmack and his many writings, I think this one is most appropriate to read to kind of close the story out. You can see all of the tall one on the left, the obelisk there, which is about 8 foot tall, roughly. Solomon, those are all put down during the war. It shows just the influence they had to get those markers there when this area is under federal occupation, that they were still able to get those there. It says the South is a land that has known sorrows. It is a land that has broken the ashen crust and moistened it with tears. A land scarred and riven by the plowshare of war and billowed with the graves of her dead, but a land of legend, land of song, and a land of hallowed and heroic memories. I think it's most important to tell these stories of our ancestors and the sufferings they went through, things that we can't even imagine. Have we all suffered in some way? I'm sure we have. We've all had trials and tribulations. But I try to get in my mind what it was like for these people at that time. Now, they had some wealth. They lost everything. By the end of the war, they're broke. There's nothing left. Can you imagine? Dad's dead now, brothers died. There's no other young men. There's a couple of other daughters. But during this time in the 1860s, you see some of the other graves scattered. The daughter that's down here in front. By 1868-69, they've lost 7 or 8 family members that are close to death. A tough time. And lost everything. What was a very well-known family, the wealthiest in probably Gibson County at the time, was literally left with nothing. So when you say, is it personal to us? It's personal to me. Can we forgive? Absolutely. We've got to be able to forgive. But do we forget that? Some have forgotten that, and this doesn't matter anymore, but I think it does. It shows what happened to right here on our homeland, like where we're standing tonight. These battles and these things like this occurred right here on the ground we stand on. So let's remember those stories of Solomon Shaw and his devotion to the South. That's just one of many that have devoted and gave their life for this cause that we still talk about and still defend today. Which we, I think, all would agree here that it's a righteous cause. They defended their homes, they defended their families. Yeah, they had 30 slaves, but other family members of mine, others, I'm sure you didn't have any. So were they fighting a rich man's war? Were they just defending their homes, defending their life and their family? Good people. I heard somebody the other day say these people were evil people. Well, I'm sure there were bad people in all of them, but I don't believe they were. I believe there are good people like me and you. Try to live good lives. I've been doing some research in Gibson County. Our first 4 churches were formed, one of them 200 years ago this last week. And you read those early minute books. And the Black brethren were in there with them, they're mentioned. They ordained one of them in the church in the 1820s. Just says a lot about the people. First thing they did when they came to Gibson County is they got their church founded. I think it's important. I think it's important we remember that.